On November 15, 2016, 17-year-old Viola Colleen broke into the home of her ex-boyfriend Mateo Martinez and shot him 5 times at close range in his bedroom in Portland, Oregon. The high school senior was found by first responders lying in a pool of his own blood with multiple gunshot wounds to his chest and head, having died almost instantly, according to the medical examiner's report. Viola had waited for Mateo's parents to leave for their dinner reservation before cutting the screen of his ground-floor bedroom window, climbing through, and confronting him as he played video games with headphones on. What began as a promising Friday evening ended in tragedy that would forever alter the lives of 2 families and send shockwaves through Portland's close-knit neighborhood communities. Before we continue with this harrowing true crime story, we'd like to welcome you to our community of viewers who seek to understand the complex psychological factors behind these tragic events. Please consider subscribing to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. We're fascinated by how these stories connect people across different time zones and backgrounds. Your perspective matters as we examine how a teenage relationship spiraled from love to obsession to murder in the rain-soaked streets of Portland, and how digital evidence would ultimately reveal the premeditation behind this shocking crime. The sound of gunshots echoed through the normally quiet residential neighborhood of Sellwood, a quaint area known for its antique shops and family-friendly atmosphere rather than violent crime. Neighbors reported hearing what they initially thought were firecrackers or car backfires, until the piercing wail of emergency sirens filled the air minutes later. 5 9mm bullet casings lay scattered across the blue carpet of Mateo's bedroom, a stark contrast to the sports posters and academic awards that decorated his walls. The weapon, a Glock 19 handgun reported missing from Viola's father's gun safe 2 days prior, was found dropped near the broken window through which she had hastily escaped after the shooting. Rain fell steadily that November night, washing away some potential evidence, but preserving a crucial set of muddy footprints leading from the window to the street where Viola had parked her car. Portland Police Bureau officers established a perimeter around the Martinez home, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the surrounding blocks for the shooter. The officers' breath fogged in the cold autumn air as they methodically documented the scene, photographing the splintered window frame, the disarray of the bedroom, and the tragic figure of Mateo Martinez still seated in his gaming chair. Inside the house, detectives noted signs of Mateo's interrupted life: a half-eaten sandwich on the desk, college application forms spread across the bed, and a framed photo of him with Viola from happier times, now face down on the floor. Viola drove aimlessly through Portland's rain-slicked streets for nearly 2 hours after the shooting, eventually returning to her parents' home in the West Hills neighborhood across town. Her mother later described finding Viola in the garage, sitting motionless in her car with the engine off, clothes soaked, and hands trembling. The teenager offered no explanation as she walked past her concerned parents and locked herself in her bathroom, where she would remain until Portland police officers arrived at their doorstep shortly after midnight. According to the arrest report, when officers asked Viola if she knew why they were there, she simply nodded and extended her wrists for the handcuffs without resistance or surprise. The Colleen family home presented a stark contrast to the crime scene, a pristine modern structure with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the twinkling lights of downtown Portland. Officers described Viola's bedroom as meticulously organized with color-coded school notes and a bulletin board covered with college brochures similar to those found in Mateo's room. A leather-bound journal recovered from beneath Viola's mattress would later provide investigators with critical insights into her deteriorating mental state following the breakup. Within its pages, detectives found increasingly disturbing entries detailing Viola's feelings of rejection, betrayal, and ultimately her explicit plans to make Mateo pay for ending their relationship. As dawn broke over Portland's iconic bridges, the gravity of the previous night's events began to settle over the city like the persistent morning fog that rolls in from the Willamette River. Students arriving at Roosevelt High School, where both Viola and Mateo were seniors, were met by crisis counselors and an increased police presence as news of the shooting spread through hushed conversations and tearful embraces. Mateo's empty desk in his advanced placement classes and his vacant spot on the soccer field served as physical reminders of the sudden void his death had created. Viola's absence, by contrast, carried a different weight, not of loss, but of betrayal, as classmates struggled to reconcile the high-achieving, seemingly well-adjusted girl they thought they knew with the murderer described in news reports. Portland's progressive, youth-oriented culture made the crime all the more shocking to local residents accustomed to property crimes and protests rather than premeditated teen homicides. The city's unique blend of environmentalism, artistic expression, and social awareness had fostered a community where young people were encouraged to express themselves and process emotions through creative outlets. School records would later show that both Viola and Mateo had participated in peer mediation programs and attended workshops on healthy relationships, making the violent outcome of their breakup seem all the more incomprehensible to educators and community leaders. The case would raise difficult questions about the effectiveness of these programs and whether warning signs had been missed by those closest to the situation. The first 48 hours following the murder were critical for the Portland Police Bureau's Homicide Division, as detectives worked to build their case against Viola Colleen. Security footage from neighboring houses captured Viola's silver Subaru driving past Mateo's home multiple times in the days leading up to the murder, suggesting reconnaissance and planning rather than a crime of passion. A search of Viola's phone revealed she had researched untraceable poisons, how to disable security cameras, and Oregon murder sentencing guidelines in the weeks before the shooting. Perhaps most damning of all was the discovery of a folder on Viola's laptop labeled M-Evidence, containing screenshots of Mateo's social media interactions with other girls, his daily schedule notated with potential intervention points, and draft messages threatening his safety that matched texts Mateo had actually received. As the first day of investigation came to a close, Detective Gabriel Fisher stood in the Portland Police Bureau's conference room, pinning the final pieces of evidence to an already crowded investigation board. The veteran detective's expression remained professional but grim as he connected the red strings between Viola's threatening messages and the timeline of the murder. The rain continued to fall outside, drumming against the windows as Fisher explained to his colleagues that this case would be different from many they had handled, not a mystery to solve, but rather a psychological puzzle to understand and a meticulous case to build. Fisher held up a printout of one of Viola's final messages to Mateo, sent just 12 hours before the murder. "You'll never get to walk away from me again." Little did he know then how crucial these documented threats would become in ensuring that Viola Colleen would indeed never walk free again. Mateo Martinez was more than just a statistic in Portland's crime reports. He was a vibrant 18-year-old with dreams that extended far beyond Oregon's rain-soaked horizon. Born to Mexican immigrant parents who had opened a successful family restaurant in Portland's Alberta Arts District, Mateo had grown up balancing two cultures with the natural ease of a generation bridging worlds. His bedroom walls told the story of his passions, soccer jerseys from the Portland Timbers hung alongside academic achievement certificates, volunteer recognition awards, and acceptance letters from several universities, including Stanford and UCLA. Friends described Mateo as someone who moved through high school social circles with unusual grace, equally comfortable discussing philosophy with the academic team as he was practicing drills with his soccer teammates. The hallways of Roosevelt High School had become unusually quiet in the days following Mateo's death, with impromptu memorials appearing at his locker and on the soccer field where he had led the team as captain for 2 consecutive years. Teachers recalled his intellectual curiosity and gentle persistence when tackling difficult concepts, qualities that had earned him a perfect GPA and recognition as a National Merit Scholar finalist. His calculus teacher, fighting back tears during an interview, remembered how Mateo would often stay after class to help struggling classmates master complex equations. Coach Reyes of the Roosevelt Rough Riders soccer team noted that Mateo had recently been scouted by several professional teams, including the Portland Timbers development program, describing him as the kind of player who made everyone around him better, both on and off the field. The Martinez family restaurant became an unexpected gathering place for the community in mourning as classmates, neighbors, and even strangers came to pay respects to the family who had lost their only son. Photos of Mateo growing up decorated the walls of the cozy establishment. From childhood snapshots of a gap-toothed boy proudly holding his first soccer trophy to recent images of a confident young man volunteering at Portland's Homeless Youth Center. His mother, Elena Martinez, spoke softly about her son's dedication to helping others, explaining how he had started a weekend tutoring program for children of immigrants struggling with language barriers. He never forgot where he came from, she said, gesturing to a photo of Mateo visiting his grandparents' small village in Oaxaca. But he was so excited about where he was going. Portland's persistent autumn rain seemed an appropriate backdrop for the community's collective grief, as hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil at Roosevelt High's soccer field exactly 1 week after the murder. Teammates wore armbands with Mateo's number 18 as they shared stories of his leadership, his famous pre-game pep talks, and his unfailing sportsmanship even in defeat. His best friend, Jordan Chen, described how Mateo had recently been helping him through his parents' difficult divorce, always making time despite his own busy schedule of college applications, soccer practice, and work at the family restaurant. "He taught me what it means to show up for people," Jordan told the crowd, his voice breaking as the rain mingled with tears on his face. "And now it feels impossible that he's the one who's gone." Mateo's academic achievements were equally impressive as his athletic prowess, with teachers noting his particular talents in mathematics and social sciences. His senior research project on economic mobility among first-generation Americans had received recognition from local universities and was being considered for publication in an undergraduate journal. The college counselor at Roosevelt shared that Mateo had received scholarship offers from 17 different universities, including a full ride to Stanford, where he planned to study economics and public policy. "He wanted to understand systems so he could change them," explained Mr. Davis, the AP government teacher who had served as Mateo's mentor. He saw his own family's success story as something he could help replicate for others through better policies and programs. The relationship between Mateo Martinez and Viola Colleen had begun during their junior year when they were paired for a chemistry lab project that friends said had sparked an immediate connection. Classmates described them as initially seeming like an ideal couple, both academically driven, involved in school activities, and supportive of each other's goals and interests. Instagram posts from those early months showed them at soccer games, hiking in Portland's Forest Park, studying together at local coffee shops, and attending school dances in color-coordinated outfits. Teachers noted that both students had maintained their excellent academic performance during the relationship, with Mateo often proudly sharing Viola's accomplishments with others, and defending her when anyone commented on her occasionally intense personality. What many of Mateo's friends didn't know was that he had begun distancing himself from Viola during the summer before their senior year, concerned about what he described to his closest confidants as her increasing possessiveness and unpredictable anger. Text messages recovered from Mateo's phone revealed his growing discomfort with Viola's demands to know his whereabouts at all times and her accusations whenever he spent time with female classmates or cousins. His parents later shared that Mateo had seemed increasingly anxious during the final months of the relationship, checking his phone constantly and sometimes asking to have friends over rather than going out. The final breaking point had come when Viola had created a scene at a family dinner celebration for his 18th birthday, accusing him of flirting with a waitress who turned out to be his cousin visiting from Mexico. According to Mateo's journal, found by detectives on his laptop, he had planned the breakup carefully, concerned about Viola's potential reaction. "I need to end things with V, but I'm worried about how she'll take it," he had written 2 weeks before their split. "I'll do it at the coffee shop where there are people around, and I'll be kind but clear that this isn't working anymore." Another entry after the breakup revealed his continued concern. "V isn't accepting that we're over. She called 37 times yesterday and waited outside soccer practice today. I told Coach what's happening, and he walked me to my car. I don't want to get her in trouble, but this is starting to scare me." These journal entries would later become crucial evidence demonstrating Mateo's growing fear of Viola in the weeks before his death. The Portland community lost more than just a promising young student athlete when Mateo's life was cut short. They lost a bridge builder whose natural diplomacy had helped ease tensions between different social groups at Roosevelt High. The school's principal described how Mateo had recently mediated a conflict between rival student groups that had threatened to escalate into serious violence, using his unique position of respect among diverse cliques to facilitate understanding. Mateo's government teacher had encouraged him to consider a future in diplomatic service, noting his remarkable ability to find common ground between opposing viewpoints while remaining true to his own principles. He had that rare quality of making people feel heard even when he disagreed with them, Mr. Davis explained, which is why everyone from the chess club to the soccer team is devastated by his loss. The Martinez family established a scholarship in Mateo's name, designed to support first-generation college students from Portland who demonstrated the same commitment to community service that had defined their son's short life. Local businesses in the Alberta neighborhood contributed to the fund, with the Portland Timbers organization making a substantial donation and retiring Mateo's Youth Academy number in his honor. At the funeral service held in the same Catholic church where Mateo had been baptized 18 years earlier, his father spoke through tears about the future that had been stolen from his son. He was going to change the world, Miguel Martinez told the overflowing congregation, his voice steadied by conviction despite his grief. And now it is our responsibility to carry forward the work he began. The first 48 hours of any homicide investigation are critical, and the Portland Police Bureau's response to Mateo Martinez's murder began the moment the 911 call came through their dispatch center. "My son, please help. Someone shot my son." Elena Martinez's frantic voice echoed through the emergency call center at 9:47 p.m., her words sometimes dissolving into rapid Spanish as the dispatcher attempted to gather essential information. The Martinez couple had returned early from their dinner reservation after Elena had experienced what she described as a mother's intuition that something was wrong and had discovered their son's body upon entering their home. First responders arrived within 4 minutes of the call, securing the scene while paramedics confirmed what the parents already knew with devastating certainty. Mateo Martinez had been pronounced dead at the scene, having suffered multiple gunshot wounds at close range. Detective Gabriel Fisher arrived at the Martinez residence just after 10:30 p.m., the blue and red lights from multiple police cruisers reflecting off the wet pavement and illuminating the concerned faces of neighbors gathered behind the yellow crime scene tape. A 20-year veteran of Portland's Homicide Division, Fisher would later describe the Martinez crime scene as methodically cruel in its execution. The detective noted the precision of the 5 gunshot wounds, 3 to the chest and 2 to the head, suggesting the shooter had stood directly in front of the victim and fired deliberately rather than in a chaotic struggle. Fisher observed that Mateo still had his gaming headphones partially on, indicating he had been taken by surprise with minimal opportunity to defend himself or escape, a detail that would later contribute to the prosecution's argument of premeditated murder rather than a crime of passion or self-defense. As crime scene technicians photographed and collected evidence from Mateo's bedroom, Fisher conducted his preliminary interviews with the devastated parents in their living room, gently extracting crucial information while respecting their acute grief. Elena Martinez, clutching her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white, provided the first suggestion of a potential suspect when she mentioned that Mateo had recently ended a relationship with a girlfriend who wouldn't accept it was over. Miguel Martinez added that they had considered filing a restraining order after the girl had appeared at their restaurant several times, creating scenes that disturbed customers and ultimately forcing them to ask their son to stop working shifts for a few weeks. The name Viola Colleen emerged as the investigation's first person of interest before the crime scene processing had even been completed, with Fisher immediately dispatching officers to the Colleen residence while he continued gathering information at the scene. The foundational clue that would ultimately drive the entire investigation emerged when Fisher asked the parents if he could examine Mateo's phone and laptop for any communications that might be relevant to the case. With their permission, digital forensics technicians began an immediate examination of Mateo's devices, discovering a folder labeled Emma Messages, containing screenshots of dozens of threatening texts, emails, and social media messages received over the past 3 months. "You'll regret leaving me," read one message from 2 months earlier, followed by increasingly disturbing communications including, "I can't sleep thinking about hurting you," and "Sometimes I imagine your parents coming home to find you bleeding out." This discovery transformed the direction of the investigation, establishing not just a potential suspect, but a documented pattern of escalating threats that pointed to premeditation rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Rain continued to fall over Portland as the night deepened, the persistent drizzle creating both challenges and opportunities for evidence collection at the crime scene. Wet footprints on the hardwood hallway leading from Mateo's bedroom had been preserved and photographed before they could dry, providing clear documentation of the killer's path through the house. Outside, however, the rain had already begun washing away potential evidence in the backyard, though technicians were able to make casts of several partial footprints near the broken window before they disappeared completely. A neighbor's security camera, partially obscured by the branches of a large Douglas fir tree characteristic of Portland's lush landscape, had captured blurry footage of a figure matching Viola's height and build approaching the Martinez home approximately 20 minutes before the estimated time of death, providing a crucial timeline for the prosecution to later establish. While the crime scene investigation continued at the Martinez residence, a parallel team of officers arrived at the Colleen home in Portland's affluent West Hills neighborhood shortly after midnight. Viola's parents, clearly shocked by the officers' appearance at their door, cooperated fully with the initial inquiry, confirming that their daughter had indeed dated Mateo Martinez, but expressing disbelief that she could be involved in any violence. They acknowledged that Viola had been upset about the breakup, but insisted she had been working through it and was focused on college applications and her future. When officers asked about Viola's whereabouts earlier that evening, her mother's confident assertion that Viola had been at home studying was contradicted by the father's uncertainty, creating the first crack in what would become a crumbling alibi. The discovery that Mr. Colleen's Glock 19 handgun was missing from his locked gun safe added another damning piece to the emerging puzzle. Viola Colleen was found in her bathroom, fully clothed and sitting on the floor with her back against the bathtub, showing no resistance when officers informed her she was being detained for questioning in connection with Mateo Martinez's death. Observant officers noted her wet clothes and shoes despite her claim of having been home all evening, as well as faint traces of what appeared to be gunshot residue on her hands despite obvious attempts to wash them clean. A search warrant executed on Viola's bedroom revealed a journal containing explicit written threats against Mateo, detailed plans of his daily schedule, and entries expressing rage about seeing him talking to other girls at school. Most significantly, detectives discovered a small box hidden in her closet containing mementos of the relationship, photos, movie ticket stubs, and a printed list titled Ways He Will Pay, with the first item chillingly checked off. Make him feel as scared as he made me feel. Back at the crime scene, the foundational clue of documented prior threats gained additional weight when Detective Fisher discovered a handwritten note in Mateo's wallet. If anything happens to me, check my laptop. Folder, name, Emma, messages. The note read in Mateo's neat handwriting, suggesting he had been genuinely fearful for his safety in the period leading up to his murder. Further examination of Mateo's phone revealed that he had recently contacted a lawyer about the possibility of obtaining a restraining order against Viola, with a consultation appointment scheduled for what would have been the following Monday. Text messages between Mateo and his best friend Jordan showed his increasing concern, with one sent just days before the murder reading. V followed me after practice again today. She was just sitting in her car watching me. I'm starting to think I should tell my parents everything. As dawn broke over Portland's distinctive skyline, turning the persistent rain clouds shades of pink and gray, the first 48 hours of investigation had yielded a remarkably clear picture of what had transpired. Detective Fisher, reviewing the evidence board at the precinct as he sipped his third cup of coffee, noted that homicide cases rarely came together with such clarity so quickly. The foundational clue of documented threats provided not just evidence of motive, but a window into Viola Colleen's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the murder, establishing a pattern of escalating behavior that culminated in violence. The methodical collection of digital evidence, combined with the physical evidence from the crime scene and the statements of witnesses, had created a preliminary case strong enough for the district attorney to approve an arrest warrant for Viola Colleen on charges of first-degree murder before the 48-hour mark had even been reached. Portland's characteristic environmental consciousness influenced even the evidence processing, as technicians carefully preserved the wet footprints using specialized techniques developed for the region's frequently rainy conditions. The bullet casings recovered from Mateo's bedroom were quickly processed through the department's ballistics lab, confirming they had been fired from a Glock 19, the same model missing from the Colleen residence. Trace evidence collected from the broken window frame included fibers that visually matched the dark blue jacket Viola had been wearing when officers arrived at her home, along with a small smear of blood that would later be confirmed through DNA testing as belonging to the suspect. The rain that had initially seemed to complicate the investigation had actually preserved certain evidence that might otherwise have been lost, creating what the forensic team supervisor described as an unusually comprehensive physical record of the crime and the perpetrator's movements. The Martinez family restaurant remained closed as the investigation continued, with a handwritten sign on the door simply stating, "Closed due to family emergency," while flowers, candles, and handwritten notes began accumulating on the sidewalk outside. In contrast, the Colleen family quickly retained Patricia Geller, one of Portland's most prominent criminal defense attorneys, who arrived at the police station before Viola's formal questioning could begin. The stark difference in the family's resources would later become a point of discussion in Portland's progressive community, raising questions about equity in the criminal justice system despite the overwhelming evidence in this particular case. Detective Fisher, known for his methodical and thorough approach, ensured that every procedural detail was properly documented and every piece of evidence properly processed. Aware that the high-profile nature of the case involving two well-known teenagers would attract significant scrutiny from the media, the public, and eventually the court. Detective Gabriel Fisher sat across from Viola Colleen in the Portland Police Bureau's interview room, the stark fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows across her face as he methodically laid out the evidence connecting her to Mateo Martinez's murder. Unlike the dramatic interrogations portrayed in television crime shows, Fisher's approach was calm, precise, and devastatingly effective, giving Viola multiple opportunities to explain the growing mountain of evidence against her. "We have your threatening messages to Mateo going back 3 months," Fisher stated, sliding printouts across the table, where Viola could see her own words staring back at her. "There are 67 distinct threats documented here, increasing in both frequency and severity after he ended your relationship in August." The detective noted that Viola's eyes darted across the pages, recognition flickering across her face before she composed herself and returned her gaze to the middle distance she had been staring at since the interview began. Viola Colleen presented a study in contrasts during those first hours of questioning, a poised, articulate 17-year-old honor student whose carefully maintained exterior occasionally cracked to reveal glimpses of rage, entitlement, and calculation. Her attorney, Patricia Geller, frequently intervened when questions became too pointed, but even she appeared taken aback by the volume and specificity of evidence Fisher methodically presented. On October 28th, you wrote to Mateo, "I know when your parents work late. I could be waiting for you any night and no one would hear you scream." Fisher read from the transcript, watching Viola's reaction closely. 2 weeks later, you searched online for how to break into a house without leaving evidence and can gunshots be heard through walls in rain. Each piece of evidence tightened the investigative noose, transforming Viola from person of interest to prime suspect with each passing hour. The digital forensics team had recovered a treasure trove of evidence from Viola's devices, despite her attempts to delete incriminating searches and messages in the hours following the murder. Portland Police Bureau's tech specialists had reconstructed a detailed timeline of Viola's obsession with Mateo after their breakup, including her creation of fake social media accounts to monitor his activities and her use of a tracking app she installed on his phone during their relationship. The app had allowed Viola to know exactly when Mateo would be home alone on the night of the murder, when his parents would be out, and how to time her attack for maximum privacy. Detective Fisher presented Viola with location data from her phone showing she had driven past the Martinez home 11 times in the week before the murder, a direct contradiction to her initial claim that she had not been in that neighborhood for months. Witness statements began flowing into the investigation, painting a disturbing picture of escalating behavior that had largely gone unreported before the murder. Teachers described classroom incidents where Viola had publicly confronted Mateo about spending time with female classmates, creating uncomfortable scenes that had required intervention. The barista at a coffee shop near Roosevelt High recounted having to ask Viola to leave after she sat for hours watching Mateo study with a group project partner, eventually approaching their table and creating a disturbance. Mateo's soccer teammates described how Viola would sometimes park across from the field during practices, taking photos and later sending Mateo messages analyzing his interactions with everyone from female students to the assistant coach. Each account added another dimension to the foundation of documented threats, moving the case from circumstantial to overwhelming. The investigation revealed that Viola had begun recording her interactions with Mateo after the breakup, apparently hoping to capture him saying something she could use against him or to manipulate him into reconciliation. Instead, these recordings, recovered from her cloud storage account, provided the investigation with damning evidence of her own behavior. In one recording from September, Mateo could be heard calmly asking Viola to stop contacting him, his voice tired and resigned, as he said, "Please, Viola, this isn't healthy for either of us. You need to move on." Viola's response shifted rapidly from pleading to threatening, ending with the chilling statement, "If I can't have you, I'm not going to let anyone else have you either." The clarity of this recording would later become a powerful piece of evidence at trial, allowing the jury to hear the contrast between Mateo's reasonable tone and Viola's increasingly unstable responses. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence to emerge came from Viola's private social media accounts, where she had joined online groups focused on revenge against ex-partners and had actively sought advice on how to make him pay without getting caught. Members of these groups had encouraged her escalating behavior, offering suggestions for tracking Mateo and approving of her increasingly violent fantasies. Digital forensics experts recovered deleted posts where Viola had shared specifics of her plans, including her access to her father's gun safe and her knowledge of when Mateo would be home alone, while group members had responded with what they later claimed was just talk or venting. One username had provided specific instructions for disabling the type of window locks the Martinez home had installed, information Viola had put to use on the night of the murder. The turning point in establishing Viola as the definitive suspect came when Detective Fisher obtained security footage from a convenience store located 2 blocks from the Martinez home. The grainy video showed Viola wearing the distinctive blue jacket recovered from her bedroom, purchasing energy drinks and cigarettes at 8:23 p.m. on the night of the murder, directly contradicting her alibi of having been home studying all evening. The store clerk remembered Viola because she had seemed jittery and intense, repeatedly checking the time on her phone while waiting in line. When shown a photo lineup, the clerk identified Viola without hesitation, adding the detail that she had been wearing gloves despite the store being warm, a detail consistent with the lack of fingerprints at the crime scene despite the broken window and disturbed items in Mateo's room. Viola's school counselor provided investigators with additional context that helped explain the psychology behind the crime, though not excuse it. Records showed that Viola had been previously treated for what the counselor carefully described as attachment and abandonment issues following her parents' nearly finalized divorce when she was 14, a process that had been abruptly halted when the couple reconciled. The counselor noted that Viola had shown concerning behaviors in previous relationships, including excessive texting, monitoring social media accounts, and extreme jealousy, though never to the degree exhibited with Mateo. These records established a pattern that prosecutors would later use to show that Viola's behavior, while extreme, was not out of character or the result of a sudden break from reality, but rather an escalation of existing tendencies that culminated in violence when she could not control the relationship's outcome. By the end of the 3rd day of investigation, Detective Fisher had compiled enough evidence to support charging Viola Colleen with first-degree murder, breaking and entering, theft of a firearm, and stalking. The Portland District Attorney's Office reviewed the case file with particular attention to the foundational evidence of prior threats, determining that the documentation provided sufficient proof of premeditation to try Viola as an adult, despite her age of 17 years and 2 months at the time of the offense. The decision to charge her as an adult sent ripples through Portland's progressive community, where juvenile justice reform had been a significant focus in recent years. However, the DA's office cited the calculated nature of the crime, the extensive planning, and the clear documentation of intent as factors that removed this case from consideration for juvenile proceedings, ensuring that Viola would face the full weight of adult charges carrying potential sentences measured in decades rather than years. As Portland's persistent November rain continued to fall outside the Justice Center, where Viola Colleen was now being held without bail, Detective Fisher added the final pieces of evidence to the case file that would be presented to the grand jury. The foundational clue of prior threats had expanded into a comprehensive case that included physical evidence, digital footprints, eyewitness accounts, and the suspect's own words documenting her descent from heartbroken teenager to calculated killer. The case represented both a professional success for the detective, a quickly solved homicide with overwhelming evidence, and a personal tragedy that Fisher, a father to teenagers himself, found deeply disturbing. Sometimes the why is as clear as the who, Fisher noted in his final case summary. And in this case, the documented threats tell the story of someone who decided that if she couldn't control Mateo Martinez in life, she would control the end of his life instead. The Portland District Attorney's Office assembled a prosecution team led by veteran prosecutor Abigail Brooks, known for her methodical approach and particular expertise in cases involving digital evidence. Brooks spent hours in the evidence room of the Justice Center, poring over the physical items collected from both the crime scene and Viola Colleen's residence, focusing on how each piece connected to the foundation of prior threats that would form the backbone of the state's case. The murder weapon, the Glock 19 stolen from Viola's father's gun safe, had been recovered from a storm drain 3 blocks from the Martinez home, with Viola's DNA on the trigger and grip, despite her apparent attempts to wipe it clean. 5 bullet casings recovered from Mateo's bedroom matched test fires from the recovered weapon, and the distinctive markings on the bullets removed during Mateo's autopsy confirmed they had been fired from the same gun, creating an unbroken chain of ballistic evidence connecting Viola to the fatal shots. Digital evidence provided prosecutors with a detailed roadmap of Viola's obsession and planning, surpassing what investigators typically encounter even in premeditated adult homicides. Forensic analysts had recovered over 6,000 text messages between Viola and Mateo during their 8-month relationship, showing a clear progression from typical teenage romance to increasingly controlling behavior on Viola's part. After the breakup in August, the one-sided nature of the communication became stark. 578 messages sent from Viola to Mateo over a 3-month period, with only 39 brief responses from Mateo, most asking her to stop contacting him or threatening to block her number. The threatening nature of Viola's messages escalated dramatically in the final weeks before the murder, with explicit statements including, "I've been watching you, you deserve to suffer, and most damning of all, I know exactly how to get into your room when no one's home." The prosecution built a comprehensive timeline using cell phone tower data, social media timestamps, and security footage from locations throughout Portland, documenting Viola's movements in the weeks leading up to the murder. Brooks arranged this evidence chronologically on a digital presentation board showing how Viola had conducted what amounted to surveillance operations on Mateo, tracking his movements between school, soccer practice, his home, and the family restaurant. The timeline revealed 7 occasions when Viola had parked near the Martinez home for extended periods, 3 instances where she had followed Mateo and his friends to social gatherings, and most disturbing of all, evidence that she had twice before approached his bedroom window in the weeks before the murder, possibly conducting practice runs for her eventual break-in. Each documented instance of stalking behavior was meticulously cross-referenced with threatening messages sent during the same time periods, creating a powerful narrative of escalation and intent. The prosecution's case gained additional strength when Brooks obtained a warrant for Viola's private journal, which her defense attorney had initially claimed was protected by privacy concerns. The contents of the journal revealed not just Viola's feelings about the breakup, but detailed plans for confronting Mateo, including multiple scenarios she had considered for making him pay. Entries dated just days before the murder included diagrams of the Martinez home based on Viola's observations, notes on the family's schedule identifying when Mateo would be home alone, and chilling statements like, "He thinks he can just move on and forget me, but I'm going to be the last thing he ever sees." Brooks recognized that these journal entries, written in Viola's own hand and secured in her bedroom, represented some of the most powerful evidence of premeditation the case could present, directly connecting her documented threats to her actual planning and execution of the murder. Witness testimony began to solidify as Brooks and her team conducted preliminary interviews with classmates, teachers, and others who had observed Viola's behavior in the months before the murder. Jordan Chen, Mateo's best friend, provided particularly compelling testimony about a disturbing encounter 3 weeks before the murder when Viola had confronted him and Mateo outside the school library. According to Jordan, Viola had appeared suddenly as they were discussing college applications, demanding to know why Mateo was ignoring her messages and becoming increasingly agitated as Mateo tried to calmly disengage from the conversation. She grabbed his arm so hard it left marks, Jordan recalled, and said something like, "You don't get to decide when this is over." Jordan had taken photos of the bruises on Mateo's arm at his friend's request, just in case something happens, images that now served as evidence of Viola's escalating physical aggression before the murder. The prosecution built a compelling psychological profile of Viola Colleen by combining school records, counseling notes, obtained with appropriate legal authorization, and statements from those who knew her. This profile revealed a young woman with academic brilliance but significant issues with control, rejection, and perceived abandonment. Viola's previous relationship patterns showed similar controlling behaviors, though never approaching the level of obsession she developed with Mateo. A particularly revealing piece of evidence came from Viola's college application essays, found on her laptop, where she had written about the intensity of my emotions and how she experienced both love and anger more deeply than others seemed to. One teacher described Viola as having difficulty accepting any result less than perfection, noting that she had once torn up an assignment in class after receiving a 98% rather than 100%. This contextual evidence helped prosecutors establish that Viola's actions, while extreme, were consistent with her personality and previous behavior patterns, rather than representing a sudden break from reality. The forensic evidence from the crime scene further strengthened the connection between Viola's documented threats and the actual execution of the murder. The broken window of Mateo's bedroom showed signs of careful cutting rather than smashing, consistent with Viola's online searches for how to cut through window screens silently. Shoe prints found both outside and inside the Martinez home matched the distinctive tread pattern of Viola's running shoes, recovered from her bedroom with traces of the same soil composition found in the Martinez backyard. Most damning were the gunshot residue tests conducted on Viola's hands and clothing, which showed positive results despite her attempts to wash away evidence. The medical examiner's report confirmed that the shots had been fired at close range in a tight grouping, indicating a shooter who was both calm enough to aim carefully and determined enough to continue firing after the first shot had already proved fatal, details consistent with execution rather than a heated confrontation or act of passion. As the case against Viola Colleen grew stronger, the prosecution faced a critical strategic decision regarding how to handle her age in relation to the severity of the charges. At 17, Viola fell into a gray area in Oregon's criminal justice system, where serious crimes could be prosecuted under either juvenile or adult statutes, depending on specific circumstances. After reviewing the extensive evidence of premeditation, Portland's district attorney made the decision to charge Viola as an adult, citing the cold, calculated nature of the crime and the clear evidence that the defendant understood the consequences of her actions. This decision meant that Viola would face a potential sentence of up to 75 years, rather than release at age 25, as would be mandated under juvenile sentencing guidelines. The decision sparked debate in Portland's legal community, with juvenile justice advocates arguing for rehabilitation rather than extended incarceration, while victims' rights groups pointed to the extensive planning and clear intent demonstrated through Viola's documented threats and subsequent actions. The prosecution's case came together with unusual speed and clarity, allowing Brooks to present a comprehensive case file to the grand jury less than 3 weeks after the murder. The grand jury proceedings, while confidential, resulted in indictments on all charges, including first-degree murder, breaking and entering, theft of a firearm, and stalking. Legal experts commenting on the case noted that the foundation of documented threats created an unusually strong demonstration of premeditation for a teenage defendant, making it one of the most straightforward decisions to try a juvenile as an adult that the Portland courts had seen in years. The indictment moved the case forward to arraignment, where Viola Colleen would officially hear the charges against her and enter her initial plea, setting in motion a legal process that would determine not just her guilt or innocence, but potentially the next 7 decades of her life. The Portland community's reaction to the developing case revealed deep divisions in how citizens viewed the intersection of youth, mental health, and criminal responsibility. News coverage of the case dominated local media, with the Oregonian newspaper running a front-page series examining how the relationship between 2 high-achieving teenagers had ended in murder, featuring interviews with adolescent psychology experts and juvenile justice advocates, alongside details of the investigation. Portland's progressive political landscape meant that many community discussions focused on whether the system had failed both teenagers, whether more intervention could have identified Viola's deteriorating mental state before it led to violence, and whether Mateo's concerns about her threatening behavior had been taken seriously enough by adults in positions of authority. Despite these broader discussions, as the evidence continued to mount, even those advocating for a more rehabilitative approach acknowledged the devastating clarity of the case Brooks and her team had built, connecting Viola's documented threats directly to her calculated execution of the murder. The formal arrest of Viola Colleen occurred 48 hours after Mateo Martinez's murder, transforming her status from a person being questioned to a defendant facing the most serious charges in Oregon's criminal code. Portland police officers formally processed Viola at the Justice Center downtown, photographing and fingerprinting the teenager while she maintained the same distant expression she had worn since being taken into custody. The booking photograph that would later appear in news reports across Oregon showed a pale 17-year-old with disheveled blonde hair and hollow eyes, bearing little resemblance to the polished honor student seen in her school yearbook photos. Detective Gabriel Fisher observed the booking process from the doorway, noting that Viola answered all procedural questions with precise, one-word responses, but volunteered no additional information or emotion. The contrast between her current demeanor and the passionate rage documented in her messages to Mateo struck Fisher as particularly telling, as though the fulfillment of her threats had emptied her of the intensity that had driven her to murder. The interrogation room at the Portland Police Bureau's Central Precinct presented a stark setting for what would become a 12-hour questioning session, interrupted only by legally mandated breaks and consultations between Viola and her attorney. The windowless room contained only a metal table bolted to the floor, 4 chairs, and recording equipment that captured every word and gesture from multiple angles. Detective Fisher began the formal interrogation with a methodical presentation of evidence, starting with the least incriminating items and gradually building toward the most damning proof of Viola's guilt. This strategy, developed over Fisher's 2 decades in homicide investigation, was designed to give suspects multiple opportunities to offer explanations or confessions before being confronted with evidence that definitively established their culpability. Viola's attorney, Patricia Geller, remained beside her throughout the process, occasionally whispering advice but primarily observing as her client's options narrowed with each new piece of evidence presented. The dynamic in the interrogation room shifted noticeably when Fisher placed a printed stack of Viola's threatening messages to Mateo on the table between them, the foundation of documented threats now physically present in the space. "I'd like to discuss these communications between you and Mateo over the past 3 months," Fisher stated calmly, sliding the top message across the table. "This one, sent on October 12th, says, 'I'm not going to let you just walk away and forget about me. I'll make sure you remember me forever.'" Viola's eyes fixed on her own words, her composed facade cracking slightly as she read the message she had sent 5 weeks before the murder. "That was just venting," she responded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone says things they don't mean when they're upset." Fisher nodded acknowledgement before sliding the next message forward. "I know where you sleep. I've been watching your house. I could be there any time." Viola's eyes widened slightly at this message from late October, and her attorney placed a cautioning hand on her arm. As the interrogation progressed, Fisher methodically connected the threatening messages to Viola's actual movements and activities, demonstrating how her words had translated directly into actions. "On November 3rd, you texted Mateo, 'I see you found a new girlfriend already. Does she know you'll abandon her too?' Fisher stated, placing the message alongside security footage showing Viola parked across from a coffee shop where Mateo was studying with a female classmate. 40 minutes after sending this message, you entered the coffee shop and created a disturbance that resulted in the manager asking you to leave. With each example, the connection between Viola's documented threats and her escalating behavior became more apparent, gradually undermining her initial claims that the messages were just words or typical breakup drama. Viola's responses became increasingly defensive, shifting from denial to minimization as the evidence mounted, her body language conveying growing discomfort as she crossed her arms tightly across her chest and avoided eye contact with both Fisher and her attorney. The interrogation reached its critical turning point when Fisher presented Viola with her own journal entries detailing plans for the murder recovered from her bedroom during the execution of the search warrant. In your own handwriting, dated November 10th, 5 days before the murder, you wrote, "I know the code to the side gate. His window is always cracked open for his stupid cat. His parents will be at their anniversary dinner on Friday. He'll be alone. Dad's gun is easy to access if I use the key in Mom's drawer," Fisher read, his voice remaining professional despite the chilling nature of the words. For the first time since her arrest, Viola's composure completely shattered, her face contorting as she struggled to maintain control. "That was just fantasy," she insisted, her voice cracking with emotion that hadn't been present in her earlier responses. "I write things to process them, not to actually do them." Fisher's most effective interrogation technique proved to be simply allowing Viola's own words, both written and recorded, to speak for themselves. He played an audio recording recovered from Viola's phone, capturing a conversation between her and Mateo 3 weeks before the murder, where Mateo could be heard saying, "Viola, you're scaring me. These threats have to stop or I'll need to talk to the police." Viola's recorded response was immediate and cold. "Go ahead. By the time they take it seriously, it'll be too late." The stark reality of hearing her own voice making what amounted to a prediction of the murder visibly affected Viola, who pressed her hands against her ears as if trying to block out her own words. Her attorney, recognizing the damaging nature of this evidence, requested a brief recess during which Viola could be heard sobbing in the consultation room, the first genuine emotion she had displayed since being taken into custody. When the interrogation resumed, Fisher shifted his approach to focus on the night of the murder itself, presenting Viola with the timeline established through cell phone data, security footage, and physical evidence. "Your phone pinged towers near Mateo's house at 8:15 p.m., he stated, displaying a map with the locations marked. "Security cameras at the convenience store 2 blocks away show you purchasing items at 8:23 p.m. The estimated time of Mateo's death based on medical examiner findings is between 9 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. Fisher continued building the timeline minute by minute, showing how the evidence placed Viola exactly where the killer would have been at each crucial moment. Viola's defenses continued to erode with each new detail, her responses shifting from outright denial to qualified statements like, "I don't remember," and "I might have been in the area, but that doesn't mean I did anything wrong." The psychological warfare of the interrogation reached its peak when Fisher presented Viola with the most disturbing piece of evidence: a series of photos Viola had taken of Mateo through his bedroom window on previous occasions, found in a hidden folder on her phone. These images, clearly taken without Mateo's knowledge or consent, showed him studying, sleeping, and changing clothes, providing undeniable proof that Viola had not only threatened to watch him, but had actually been doing so for weeks before the murder. "I had a right to know what he was doing," Viola suddenly declared, her voice taking on an edge that hadn't been present earlier in the interrogation. "He was mine for 8 months. He didn't get to just decide it was over and move on like I meant nothing." This unexpected outburst represented the first time Viola had abandoned her defense of the threats as just words, instead attempting to justify her surveillance behavior by claiming some form of ownership over Mateo, a justification that revealed more about her mindset than any evidence Fisher had presented. Viola's attorney attempted to redirect the interrogation numerous times, particularly when her client's statements began to suggest guilt rather than innocence. Geller repeatedly advised Viola of her right to remain silent, especially as the questioning focused more directly on the night of the murder and the actual shooting. Despite these legal interventions, Viola increasingly struggled to maintain a coherent defense as the hours passed and the evidence mounted. When confronted with gunshot residue found on her clothing, despite her attempts to clean up after the murder, Viola's response shifted from denial to a different kind of rationalization. "Even if I was there, you can't prove I went there planning to hurt him. Maybe I just wanted to talk and things got out of control." This statement represented a significant shift in her position, moving from complete denial to suggesting a lesser offense of heat of passion killing rather than premeditated murder, a distinction that would have massive implications for potential sentencing, but still amounted to an admission of her presence at the scene and involvement in Mateo's death. The culmination of the interrogation came when Fisher directly confronted Viola with the most damning connection between her threats and the murder itself. "In your final text message to Mateo, sent at 3:14 p.m. on the day of his death, you wrote, 'You'll never get to walk away from me again,'" Fisher stated, placing the phone record on the table. 12 hours later, you broke into his bedroom and shot him 5 times, ensuring he would never walk away from anyone again. The room fell silent as Viola stared at the message, her face now devoid of the artificial composure she had initially maintained. For nearly a full minute, no one spoke, the only sound the soft whirring of the recording equipment capturing what would become a key moment in the eventual trial. Finally, Viola raised her eyes to meet Fisher's for the first time in hours and spoke words that effectively ended the interrogation. "I want to go back to my cell now." Detective Fisher wrapped up the interrogation shortly after midnight, having built an overwhelming case connecting Viola's documented threats directly to her actions on the night of the murder. The 12-hour session had yielded significant results despite Viola's refusal to provide an explicit confession, her evolving responses from complete denial to attempts at justification to suggesting a crime of passion rather than premeditation, created a record that prosecutors would later use to demonstrate consciousness of guilt. As Viola was led back to her cell in the juvenile section of the detention center, where she was being held despite being charged as an adult, Fisher began the process of organizing the interrogation transcript and video to be added to the case file. The connection between Viola's threatening words and her deadly actions had been established beyond reasonable doubt, creating the foundation upon which the prosecution would build their case for premeditated murder carrying the maximum possible sentence under Oregon law. The Multnomah County Courthouse stood as an imposing neoclassical structure in downtown Portland, its stone columns and broad steps having witnessed generations of justice being administered since its construction in 1911. On a rainy Monday morning in February, 3 months after Mateo Martinez's murder, the courthouse became the center of intense public attention as Viola Colleen's trial began. Local media had been covering the case extensively since the arrest, with opinion pieces debating everything from juvenile justice reform to missed warning signs of violent behavior in teenagers. Security was unusually tight for the proceedings, with additional officers posted throughout the building due to both the high-profile nature of the case and the fact that the defendant was still technically a minor, despite being tried as an adult. The somber atmosphere inside the courtroom reflected the gravity of the charges, with Judge Eleanor Weaver's opening instructions to the jury emphasizing their responsibility to evaluate the evidence impartially despite the emotional nature of the case and the youth of the defendant. Prosecutor Abigail Brooks approached the trial with the methodical precision that had defined her 20-year career, having built a reputation for cases that were thoroughly researched and strategically presented. Her opening statement laid out a clear narrative that connected every piece of evidence to the foundation of documented threats, creating a roadmap for the jury to follow through what would be weeks of testimony. This is not a case about a momentary lapse of judgment or a teenager who didn't understand the consequences of her actions, Brooks told the jury, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. The evidence will show that Viola Colleen spent months threatening Mateo Martinez, weeks planning his murder, and seconds ending his life with 5 precisely placed bullets. Brooks deliberately avoided emotional appeals in her opening, instead focusing on the timeline of escalation from the first threatening message sent after the breakup to the final shot fired in Mateo's bedroom, establishing a narrative of calculated intent rather than impulsive teenage behavior. Defense attorney Patricia Geller faced the daunting task of developing a strategy that could counter the overwhelming evidence connecting her client to both the threatening messages and the murder itself. Unable to dispute the basic facts given the forensic evidence, Geller's opening statement instead focused on Viola's mental state, suggesting that her actions stemmed from a perfect storm of adolescent brain development, untreated mental health issues, and the crushing intensity of first love and first heartbreak. Geller painted a picture of a troubled teenager whose threats had been cries for help rather than declarations of intent, emphasizing that the system failed Viola Colleen long before she failed herself. This approach sought to shift some responsibility to the adults in Viola's life, suggesting that parents, teachers, and counselors had missed critical warning signs that might have prevented the tragedy if properly addressed, while simultaneously laying groundwork for a potential diminished capacity defense focused on Viola's psychological state rather than disputing her actions. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders and crime scene technicians, establishing the basic facts of the murder scene before moving on to the foundation of documented threats. Digital forensics expert Dr. Sarah Chen took the stand on the second day of trial, presenting a comprehensive analysis of the threatening messages Viola had sent to Mateo in the months leading up to his death. Using large screen displays visible to the jury, Dr. Chen walked through the progression of the threats, noting how they evolved from expressions of hurt and anger to specific statements about watching Mateo, knowing his schedule, and eventually detailed scenarios of violence. We categorize the messages based on escalation patterns typically seen in stalking cases, Dr. Chen explained, displaying a graph showing the increasing frequency and severity of the threats over time. The data shows a clear pattern of progression from emotional venting to surveillance to explicit threats of harm, following a trajectory that is unfortunately predictable in cases that end in violence. The courtroom fell silent as prosecutors played audio recordings recovered from Viola's phone, capturing conversations between her and Mateo in the weeks before his death. The recordings, made without Mateo's knowledge, revealed his growing fear as he repeatedly asked Viola to leave him alone, his voice becoming increasingly desperate as her responses grew more threatening. "Please, Viola, this has to stop. You're scaring me." Mateo's voice echoed through the courtroom, the pain and fear evident even through the slightly distorted audio. "I'll stop when you come back to me," Viola's recorded voice responded coldly. "Until then, you should be scared." The Martinez family, seated in the front row behind the prosecution table, held hands tightly during this testimony, Elena Martinez quietly weeping as she heard her son's voice for the first time since his death. Viola, by contrast, stared straight ahead throughout the playback, her expression unreadable, as her own words provided some of the most damning evidence against her. Detective Gabriel Fisher's testimony spanned 3 full days as he methodically walked the jury through every aspect of the investigation, from the initial crime scene to Viola's eventual arrest and interrogation. Fisher proved to be a compelling witness, his matter-of-fact delivery and clear expertise lending weight to his explanations of how each piece of evidence connected to create a comprehensive picture of premeditation. Based on the documented threats, we were able to identify specific behaviors that showed planning and intent, Fisher explained, displaying a timeline that connected Viola's threatening messages to her actual movements in the weeks before the murder. For example, on October 27th, the defendant sent a message saying, "I know when your window is open for your cat." And later that same night, security footage shows her approaching the window of Mateo's bedroom, apparently testing whether she could gain entry. Fisher's testimony was particularly effective in demonstrating how Viola's written and verbal threats had directly translated into reconnaissance and planning activities, establishing the critical link between her words and the eventual murder. The prosecution's presentation of digital evidence continued, with testimony from Viola's former classmates who described witnessing her increasingly erratic behavior in the months following her breakup with Mateo. Jordan Chen's testimony proved particularly powerful as he recounted specific incidents where Viola had followed, confronted, or threatened Mateo. "He was really scared toward the end," Jordan told the jury, his voice breaking slightly as he recalled conversations with his friend. "He showed me these texts where she threatened him, and I told him to go to the police, but he said he didn't want to ruin her life over what might just be talk." Jordan described how Mateo had begun changing his routines to avoid Viola, asking friends to walk him to his car after practice, and expressing fear about being alone at home. The last time I saw him, 2 days before he died, he told me he was going to talk to a lawyer about a restraining order on Monday, Jordan testified. He said, "If anything happens to me, make sure they check my computer. I've saved everything she sent me." The prosecution's strategy of building their case on the foundation of documented threats reached its most powerful point when they presented Viola's journal entries detailing her plans for the murder. Forensic document examiner Dr. Martin Reeves testified to the authenticity of the handwriting, confirming that the journal entries matched known samples of Viola's writing from school assignments and other documents. Brooks had the entries projected onto screens visible to both the jury and the gallery as Dr. Reeves read selected passages aloud. November 10th, I found the key to Dad's gun safe. It's heavier than I expected, but easy to aim. I practiced holding it when everyone was out yesterday, one entry read. Another, dated just 2 days before the murder, stated, I've watched his house enough to know the pattern. Friday night. Parents out for their anniversary. He'll be alone playing those stupid games with his headphones on. He won't even hear me come in. The detailed planning documented in Viola's own handwriting provided irrefutable evidence that the murder had been premeditated rather than impulsive, directly connecting her threatening messages to her actual intentions and actions. The defense team faced significant challenges in countering the prosecution's methodical presentation of evidence, often focusing their cross-examinations on contextual factors rather than disputing the core facts. During cross-examination of the school counselor who had worked with Viola, Geller emphasized that the teenager had sought help for feelings of abandonment and rejection following the breakup, but had not received the level of intervention her situation required. Would you agree that Viola's increasingly concerning behavior represented clear warning signs that should have triggered more significant mental health intervention? Geller asked. The counselor acknowledged that, in hindsight, more should have been done, though she noted that Viola had been extremely skilled at presenting as functional and in control when speaking with authority figures. This line of questioning aimed to support the defense's narrative that Viola's actions resulted from mental health issues that had been inadequately addressed rather than from calculated malice, though it did little to counter the extensive evidence of planning and premeditation presented by the prosecution. As the first week of trial concluded, legal observers noted that the prosecution had built an unusually strong case connecting Viola's documented threats directly to her actions on the night of the murder. Local legal analyst and former prosecutor Maya Jefferson, commenting for Portland's KPTV News, explained that juvenile defendants are typically viewed more sympathetically by juries who consider their youth and still developing brains as mitigating factors. What makes this case different, Jefferson noted, is the extensive documentation of threats and planning that shows a level of premeditation we rarely see even in adult murder cases. The analyst highlighted how Prosecutor Brooks had strategically centered the case on the foundation of documented threats, using Viola's own words and actions to overcome potential jury bias toward leniency based on her age. The prosecution isn't asking the jury to speculate about what Viola Colleen was thinking, Jefferson concluded. They're showing exactly what she was thinking in her own words over a period of months, leading directly to the night she acted on those thoughts. As Judge Weaver gavelled the court into recess for the weekend, the weight of the week's testimony hung heavily over the courtroom. Viola Colleen sat between her attorneys, her polished appearance at the start of trial now somewhat diminished, dark circles visible beneath her eyes despite attempts at concealment. Across the aisle, the Martinez family exited quietly, their dignified grief having made a visible impression on the jury throughout the proceedings. The first phase of trial had effectively established the prosecution's core narrative, that Viola Colline had not only threatened Mateo Martinez repeatedly, but had methodically planned and executed his murder exactly as she had described in her messages and journal entries. As members of the jury filed out, several glanced toward Viola, their expressions suggesting that her youth was no longer the primary lens through which they viewed the defendant, but rather the calculated nature of her actions as documented in her own threatening words. The second week of trial began with what prosecutors described as their linchpin witness, digital forensics specialist Dr. Elijah Montgomery, whose expertise in analyzing patterns of online behavior had made him a sought-after expert in cases involving digital threats and stalking. With 30 years of experience and a background that included work with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, Dr. Montgomery brought significant credibility to the witness stand as he prepared to explain the significance of Viola Colline's threatening messages within the context of established threat assessment protocols. The courtroom was noticeably tenser than it had been during the previous week, with several jurors leaning forward in their seats as Dr. Montgomery was sworn in, his credentials establishing him as someone who could provide critical context for understanding the progression from digital threats to physical violence that formed the core of the prosecution's case against Viola. Dr. Montgomery began his testimony by explaining the methodology he had used to analyze the hundreds of messages Viola had sent to Mateo in the months leading up to his murder. I categorized each communication using the standard threat assessment matrix developed by the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, he explained, as a detailed chart appeared on screens throughout the courtroom. This analysis looks at factors including specificity of the threat, expressed intent to act, steps taken toward actualization, and escalation patterns over time. The expert walked the jury through his findings, noting that Viola's communications had evolved through distinct phases that forensic psychologists recognize as warning signs of impending violence. In the early weeks after the breakup, the messages show what we classify as grievance formation, expressions of being wronged, and demands for justice, Dr. Montgomery explained, highlighting examples on the screen. By October, they had progressed to what we call ideation, specific descriptions of how she might harm Mateo, followed by evidence of research and planning as she gathered information about his schedule and home security. The prosecution guided Dr. Montgomery through a detailed timeline that correlated Viola's threatening messages with her actual movements and actions, creating a comprehensive picture of escalation from words to reconnaissance to murder. This message from October 21st, where she writes, "I know when you're alone in your room at night," corresponds with cell tower data, placing her phone near the Martinez residence between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. that same night, he testified, highlighting the timestamps on both the message and the location data. Similarly, this November 3rd message threatening to make you regret ever leaving me was sent 30 minutes before security cameras captured her following Mateo from soccer practice to a study session at the library. For each threatening message presented, Dr. Montgomery explained how it represented not just angry words but specific indicators of intent that, when combined with Viola's concurrent actions, created what he described as one of the clearest cases of documented progression from threat to action that I've encountered in my 30 years of analyzing threatening communications. The expert's testimony became particularly powerful when he addressed the sophistication of Viola's threatening behavior relative to her age. While adolescents often make impulsive threats they don't intend to act upon, what distinguishes this case is the methodical nature of both the communications and the accompanying behaviors, Dr. Montgomery explained, displaying side-by-side comparisons of typical teenage threatening messages versus Viola's more calculated approach. The defendant's threats show evidence of what we call operational planning, specific details about how, when, and where she would carry out an attack, coupled with actual steps to gather necessary information and resources. He pointed to messages where Viola had explicitly referenced Matteo's bedroom window, his parents' schedule, and her access to a weapon, details that matched precisely with how the murder was eventually carried out. In my professional assessment, these communications represent not emotional venting, but a documented roadmap of premeditation that the defendant then followed to its intended conclusion. Defense attorney Patricia Geller's cross-examination attempted to challenge Dr. Montgomery's conclusions by focusing on alternative interpretations of the threatening messages. Isn't it possible that a 17-year-old might use extreme language as a form of emotional expression without actual intent to cause harm? She asked, attempting to frame Viola's messages as typical teenage hyperbole rather than genuine threats. Dr. Montgomery acknowledged that context matters in assessing threats, but remained firm in his assessment. While adolescents do sometimes express emotions in exaggerated ways, what differentiates genuine threats from hyperbole is the pattern of behavior that accompanies the words, he explained. When we see threats that increase in specificity over time, contain actionable details, and are paired with stalking behaviors like surveillance and information gathering, as we do in this case, they represent a significantly elevated risk of actual violence. Geller's attempts to portray Viola's threats as merely the dramatic expressions of a heartbroken teenager largely failed to undermine the expert's methodical analysis of the documented pattern of escalation from threat to action. The prosecution's case gained additional strength with testimony from ballistics expert Anthony Ramirez, who connected the foundational clue of prior threats to the physical evidence of the murder itself. Using detailed visual aids, Ramirez explained how the 5 shots that killed Matteo Martinez had been fired in a pattern consistent with an execution rather than a struggle or moment of passion. The grouping of these wounds indicates a shooter who was standing still, aiming deliberately and firing methodically, Ramirez testified, displaying autopsy photos that caused several jurors to wince visibly. The first shot was to the center mass of the chest, followed by 2 more to the chest in close proximity, and then 2 final shots to the head. This evidence directly contradicted the defense's suggestion that the shooting might have resulted from an emotional confrontation that escalated unexpectedly, instead supporting the prosecution's narrative that Viola had carried out precisely the kind of calculated attack she had described in her threatening messages, shooting to kill rather than acting in the heat of the moment. The connection between Viola's documented threats and her actions on the night of the murder became even more explicit with testimony from computer forensics investigator Jason Wong, who had recovered search history from Viola's devices. In the 2 weeks before the murder, the defendant conducted searches including how many shots to guarantee death, quietest way to break window, and average police response time Portland residential neighborhoods, Wong testified, displaying screenshots of the search history alongside the threatening messages sent during the same time period. She also researched the specific model of gun her father owned, watching instructional videos on how to load, aim, and fire a Glock 19. Wong's testimony established that Viola had not only threatened violence, but had actively researched how to carry out those threats effectively, gathering the information needed to execute the murder exactly as she had described in her messages to Matteo and entries in her journal. Perhaps the most damning testimony connecting Viola's threats to her actions came from her own former friend, Sophia Reynolds, who had initially been reluctant to testify against someone she had once considered a close companion. Visibly uncomfortable on the witness stand, Sophia recounted a conversation with Viola 2 weeks before the murder, during which the defendant had explicitly discussed killing Mateo. She showed me this list she'd made of ways to hurt him, and I thought she was just venting, Sophia testified, her voice barely above a whisper. But then she said, "I could just take my dad's gun, you know. He never checks it." I told her she was being crazy, and she got this really calm look and said, "Sometimes the crazy option is the only one that works." Sophia further testified that she had seen Viola practicing a signature different from her own in the weeks before the murder, which prosecutors connected to evidence that Viola had forged her mother's signature to access her father's gun safe key from a locked drawer, demonstrating another level of planning and premeditation consistent with her threatening messages. As the prosecution's case neared completion, they presented perhaps their strongest evidence connecting Viola's threats directly to the murder, a video recording from Mateo's laptop captured on the night of his death. The laptop's webcam had been activated by motion detection software Mateo had installed specifically because of his concerns about Viola's threatening behavior, recording the final moments of his life. The grainy footage showed Mateo playing a video game with headphones on, then suddenly turning toward his window with an expression of shock as Viola appeared in the frame, gun raised. Although the actual shooting occurred off-camera, the audio captured Viola's voice saying clearly, "I told you I wouldn't let you walk away," directly echoing the threatening message she had sent hours earlier. This chilling evidence, presented near the end of the prosecution's case, visibly affected everyone in the courtroom. Several jurors openly wept. The Martinez family held each other in shared grief, and even Viola herself finally showed emotion, lowering her head to the defense table as her own words and actions were played back in devastating clarity. The defense began presenting their case with testimony from adolescent psychiatrist Dr. Rebecca Chen, who offered an alternative framework for understanding Viola's threatening messages and subsequent actions. The teenage brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and understanding consequences, is still developing well into the early 20s, Dr. Chen explained, displaying brain scan images to illustrate her points. This neurological immaturity, combined with the intense emotions associated with first love and perceived rejection, can create a perfect storm where threats may escalate without the teenager fully comprehending the gravity or finality of their actions. While careful not to excuse Viola's behavior, Dr. Chen attempted to contextualize it within a developmental framework that might support the defense's argument for diminished capacity rather than calculated premeditation. However, during cross-examination, Prosecutor Brooks effectively challenged this narrative by highlighting the extended time frame of Viola's threatening and planning behaviors, asking, if this were truly impulsive behavior resulting from an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, would we expect to see 2 months of documented planning, including practice runs, research, and the creation of detailed written plans? As the expert testimony phase of the trial concluded, Judge Weaver instructed the jury on how to evaluate the complex evidence they had heard, emphasizing that expert opinions should be weighed alongside factual evidence in determining whether Viola Colleen had committed premeditated murder. The consistent thread throughout the prosecution's case had been the direct connection between Viola's documented threats and her actions on the night she killed Mateo Martinez, establishing through multiple forms of evidence that she had not only threatened violence, but had methodically planned and executed exactly the kind of attack described in her messages. Defense attempts to frame these threats as the emotional expressions of an immature teenager had largely failed to overcome the mountain of evidence showing that Viola had meant exactly what she said when she threatened Mateo and had carried out those threats with chilling precision. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, legal observers noted that the prosecution had built one of the strongest cases of premeditation ever seen in Oregon's courts, particularly for a defendant of Viola's age, using her own documented threats as the foundation for establishing both intent and method in the murder of Mateo Martinez. The Multnomah County Courthouse fell silent as Judge Eleanor Weaver addressed the packed courtroom on the morning that closing arguments were scheduled to begin. After 3 weeks of testimony, mountains of evidence, and expert analysis from both sides, the moment had arrived for final statements before the case would be placed in the jury's hands. Security had been increased following intense media coverage that had transformed the trial into a national conversation about teenage violence, digital threats, and the appropriate punishment for juvenile offenders charged as adults. The Portland community had become deeply invested in the proceedings, with daily coverage in the Oregonian newspaper and local television stations conducting evening specials exploring the case's implications for parents, educators, and the legal system. Judge Weaver's stern instructions against demonstrations in the courtroom underscored the emotional weight of the proceedings, as both the Colleen and Martinez families sat in tense silence on opposite sides of the aisle, preparing to hear the final arguments that would shape the jury's deliberations on Viola Colleen's fate. Prosecutor Abigail Brooks approached the jury box with the same methodical composure that had characterized her presentation throughout the trial, carrying only a single sheet of paper containing the timeline of Viola's threats alongside her corresponding actions. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is ultimately about the connection between words and actions, between threats made and threats carried out, Brooks began, her voice firm and measured. Over the past 3 weeks, you have seen overwhelming evidence that Viola Colleen didn't just threaten Mateo Martinez. She methodically planned and executed his murder exactly as she had described in her own words. Brooks walked the jury through the progression from Viola's initial threatening messages after the breakup to her surveillance activities, her research on methods, her acquisition of the murder weapon, and finally, to the night she broke into Mateo's bedroom and shot him 5 times at close range. The foundational evidence in this case, the documented threats that Viola sent over a period of months, provides not just motive, but a literal script for the murder she would eventually commit, Brooks concluded, holding up the final threatening message Viola had sent hours before the murder. When she wrote, "You'll never get to walk away from me again," she meant exactly what she said, and she ensured it through calculated, premeditated murder. Defense attorney Patricia Geller faced the daunting task of delivering a closing argument that could counter the prosecution's overwhelming evidence while acknowledging the undeniable facts of the case. No one in this courtroom disputes that Viola Colleen sent threatening messages to Mateo Martinez, nor that she was present when he died, Geller began, taking a different approach than complete denial. What we ask you to consider is the context in which those messages were sent and the state of mind of the 17-year-old girl who sent them. Geller focused heavily on Viola's age, brain development, and what she characterized as inadequate intervention by the adults in her life who had seen warning signs but failed to take decisive action. The prosecution wants you to view these messages as the calculated plans of a cold-blooded killer, but the evidence shows they were the increasingly desperate communications of a teenager in psychological crisis who didn't receive the help she needed, Geller argued, attempting to reframe the threats as symptoms of mental health issues rather than expressions of genuine intent. This tragedy could have been prevented at multiple points if any adult had recognized the severity of Viola's deteriorating mental state and intervened appropriately. In her rebuttal, Brooks directly addressed the defense's attempt to shift focus away from Viola's agency in the murder. The defense would have you believe that Viola Colleen was a passive participant in her own actions, swept along by teenage emotions, and failed by the adults around her, Brooks stated, her tone firm but not unsympathetic. But the evidence tells a different story, one of active planning, calculated deception, and deliberate execution. Brooks reminded the jury of key pieces of evidence: Viola's disguising her handwriting to access her father's gun, her surveillance of the Martinez home to learn their schedules, her research on how to break in without detection, and her final words to Mateo before shooting him. These are not the actions of someone who doesn't understand the consequences of their behavior, Brooks concluded. They are the actions of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and took methodical steps to ensure they wouldn't be stopped. As Brooks returned to her seat, the courtroom remained utterly silent, the weight of her arguments hanging in the air as Judge Weaver prepared to give the jury their final instructions before deliberation. Judge Weaver's instructions to the jury were comprehensive, covering the legal definitions of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and manslaughter, as well as the standards for determining premeditation and intent. First-degree murder requires that the defendant acted with premeditation, meaning the decision to kill was made with a cool mind before the act itself, the judge explained, her voice carrying the authority of her 20 years on the bench. In determining whether Viola Colleen acted with premeditation, you may consider threats made before the killing, preparation, or planning before the killing, and the method and manner of the killing itself. Judge Weaver also addressed the defense's arguments regarding Viola's age and mental state, instructing jurors that while they could consider these factors, being a juvenile did not automatically preclude the capacity for premeditation under Oregon law. Your task is to determine whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crime of first-degree murder as defined by the law, the judge concluded, before sending the jury to begin their deliberations at 11:17 on a rainy Tuesday morning. The jury's deliberation lasted 6 hours and 23 minutes, a duration that legal analysts later described as surprisingly brief, given the complexity of the case and the youth of the defendant. As word spread that the jury had reached a verdict, the courtroom quickly filled beyond capacity, with journalists and legal observers crowding the hallways outside. Viola Colleen appeared noticeably anxious as she was led back into the courtroom, her usual composed facade cracking to reveal the frightened teenager beneath as she continuously glanced toward her parents, seated directly behind the defense table. The Martinez family entered together, Elena and Miguel Martinez holding hands with the quiet dignity they had maintained throughout the trial, their extended family filling 2 rows behind the prosecution table. Judge Weaver called for silence as the jury filed in, their expressions solemn, and several showing signs of emotional strain from the weight of their decision. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Weaver asked the foreperson, a middle-aged high school teacher who had been selected to speak for the group. At the affirmative response, the judge instructed the clerk to read the verdict, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence, the only sound the soft rustle of paper as the clerk prepared to announce the jury's decision. In the matter of the state of Oregon versus Viola Colleen, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by muffled sobs from both families, as the clerk continued reading guilty verdicts for the additional charges of breaking and entering, theft of a firearm, and stalking. Viola Colleen's composure finally shattered completely at the word guilty, her body seeming to collapse in on itself as she began to sob openly, her shoulders shaking as the reality of the verdict appeared to hit her with full force. The reactions within the courtroom captured the complex emotions surrounding the case that had divided Portland's community. Elena Martinez closed her eyes and whispered what appeared to be a prayer as tears streamed down her face, while Miguel Martinez remained stoically upright, his jaw clenched and eyes fixed straight ahead. Viola's mother collapsed against her husband's shoulder, her body racked with sobs as she witnessed her daughter's future effectively sealed by the verdict. In the gallery, Mateo's teammates from the Roosevelt High soccer team sat together in silent solidarity, several wiping away tears as the verdict provided a measure of justice for their friend, but no relief from their loss. Portland Police Detective Gabriel Fisher, seated near the back of the courtroom, maintained his professional demeanor but nodded slightly at the verdict, his expression reflecting satisfaction, not in Viola's pain, but in the system having worked as intended, connecting her documented threats directly to accountability for the actions that followed. Judge Weaver thanked the jury for their service before addressing scheduling for the sentencing phase, setting a date 3 weeks later to allow time for pre-sentencing reports and impact statements. As Viola was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, her plaintive, "Mom, please," echoed through the suddenly silent room, the sound of a teenager facing the consequences of actions that had ended one life and irrevocably altered her own. Outside the courthouse, divided groups of protesters represented the community's split perspective on the case, some holding signs demanding justice for Mateo and supporting the maximum sentence, while others advocated for juvenile justice reform, with messages like, "Rehabilitation, not incarceration," and "She's still a child." Local news crews captured these contrasting viewpoints, highlighting the case's role in sparking broader conversations about how society should respond when teenagers commit horrific crimes after explicitly threatening to do so. In the days following the verdict, Portland's media landscape was dominated by analysis and reaction to Viola Colleen's conviction. Legal experts appeared on local television to explain the significance of the jury's quick deliberation, with former prosecutor Maya Jefferson noting, "The speed of this verdict suggests the jury found the evidence of premeditation overwhelming, particularly the direct connection between Viola's threatening messages and her actions on the night of the murder." Mental health professionals used the case to highlight the importance of taking teenage threats seriously, with child psychiatrist Dr. James Liu telling the Oregonian, "One of the most dangerous misconceptions is that teenagers who make explicit threats are just being dramatic. This case tragically demonstrates that some threats represent genuine declarations of intent, particularly when accompanied by planning behaviors." Schools across Oregon announced plans to revise their threat assessment protocols in response to the case, acknowledging that warning signs in Viola's behavior had been visible but not adequately addressed before tragedy occurred. The Martinez family released a brief statement through their attorney, following the verdict, expressing gratitude for the justice system while acknowledging that no outcome could undo their loss. "Today's verdict cannot bring back our son, but it does provide accountability for the calculated actions that took him from us," the statement read. Mateo was more than a victim. He was a loving son, a dedicated student, and a young man with limitless potential whose dreams will never be realized. We ask for privacy as we continue to grieve while finding ways to honor Mateo's memory through the Scholarship Foundation established in his name. The statement made no mention of Viola Colleen or her family, focusing instead on Mateo's legacy and the Martinez family's ongoing healing process. The measured tone reflected the dignity with which the family had conducted themselves throughout the trial, earning them the respect of the Portland community despite the intense emotions surrounding the case. Viola Colleen's conviction on all charges set the stage for a sentencing hearing that would determine whether she would spend the remainder of her life in prison or have the possibility of eventual release. Legal experts noted that, under Oregon law, the first-degree murder conviction carried a minimum sentence of 30 years without possibility of parole, with the potential for additional consecutive sentences for the accompanying charges. The verdict represented not just the conclusion of a legal process, but a definitive statement on the connection between digital threats and physical violence in the 21st century, establishing that threatening messages, when followed by corresponding actions, create a clear pattern of premeditation regardless of the age of the person making those threats. As Portland's persistent rain fell on the courthouse steps, where reporters delivered their final verdicts on the verdict itself. The city grappled with difficult questions about accountability, intervention, and what justice truly means when both the perpetrator and victim are teenagers whose lives intersected with tragic consequences. 3 weeks after the guilty verdict, the Multnomah County Courthouse once again filled beyond capacity for Viola Colleen's sentencing hearing. The intervening period had seen intense debate throughout Portland and beyond regarding appropriate punishment for a 17-year-old convicted of premeditated murder, with newspaper editorials, social media campaigns, and community forums reflecting deeply divided opinions. Judge Eleanor Weaver had received hundreds of letters from across the country, some arguing for the maximum possible sentence given the calculated nature of the crime, others pleading for leniency based on Viola's age and potential for rehabilitation. The morning of sentencing brought protesters from both perspectives to the courthouse steps, their competing chants audible even within the building's thick walls. Inside the courtroom, additional security personnel stood at regular intervals, a precaution against potential disruptions during what promised to be an emotionally charged proceeding. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements, providing the Martinez family their first opportunity to directly address both the court and Viola Colleen regarding the devastating effects of Mateo's murder. Elena Martinez approached the podium carrying a framed photograph of her son, which she placed facing Viola before speaking in a voice that trembled with emotion but never broke. Mateo was our only child, the center of our world, and the culmination of all our hopes and dreams, she began, occasionally shifting between English and Spanish as she described the daily reality of grief that had become her family's constant companion. Every morning I wake up, and for one blessed second, I forget what happened. And then I remember that I will never see my son smile again, never hear his laugh, never watch him grow into the amazing man he was becoming. Miguel Martinez followed his wife, his testimony more focused on the future that had been stolen from their son. Mateo had just been accepted to Stanford with a full scholarship. He was going to study economics and public policy because he wanted to help immigrant families like ours build better lives in this country. That future, all the people he would have helped, all the good he would have done, that died with him in his bedroom that night. Other impact statements followed from Mateo's extended family, friends, teachers, and coaches, each providing a different perspective on the life that had been cut short and the ripple effects of that loss throughout the community. Jordan Chen, Mateo's best friend, spoke about the survivor's guilt he continued to feel, wondering if he could have prevented the murder by taking Viola's threats more seriously or convincing Mateo to seek police protection sooner. Mateo's soccer coach described how the team had struggled through the remainder of their season, playing with Mateo's jersey displayed on the bench at every game, ultimately dedicating their state championship victory to his memory. Perhaps most moving was the statement from a 12-year-old boy Mateo had been tutoring, who described how Mateo had helped him overcome his fear of mathematics and inspired him to believe he could attend college someday, despite his family's limited resources. Throughout these statements, Viola Colleen sat motionless at the defense table, her eyes downcast, occasionally wiping tears but never raising her gaze to meet those speaking about the life she had taken. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Viola Colleen rose shakily to her feet, noticeably thinner than she had been at the start of the trial and looking far younger than her 17 years in a simple navy blue dress chosen to project humility rather than the professional attire she had worn during trial. "I know that nothing I can say will bring Mateo back or ease his family's pain," she began, her voice barely audible until Judge Weaver instructed her to speak into the microphone. "I can't explain why I did what I did. I've tried to understand it myself every day since it happened." Viola's statement lacked the polish of a prepared speech, instead coming across as the halting reflections of someone still struggling to comprehend her own actions. The messages I sent, I can't believe those words came from me, but they did, and then I actually did the terrible things I threatened to do. For the first time, Viola raised her eyes to look directly at the Martinez family. I'm sorry, I know that's not enough. It will never be enough. But I am truly, deeply sorry for taking Mateo from you and from the world. Prosecutor Abigail Brooks delivered the state's sentencing recommendation with the same methodical approach that had characterized her handling of the entire case, focusing on the factors that distinguished this murder from typical cases involving juvenile defendants. Your Honor, the state recommends a sentence of 70 years, to include the minimum 30 years without possibility of parole for the first-degree murder conviction, with consecutive sentences for the additional charges, Brooks stated. This recommendation is based on three factors that make this case extraordinary. First, the calculated premeditation documented through the defendant's own threats and journal entries. Second, the repeated opportunities for intervention or reconsideration that the defendant ignored over a period of months. And third, the execution-style nature of the killing itself. Brooks emphasized that while Viola's age was a relevant consideration, it could not outweigh the overwhelming evidence that she had understood exactly what she was doing at every stage from threatening to planning to killing Mateo Martinez, making her case different from those involving impulsive actions by immature teenagers. Defense attorney Patricia Geller countered with an impassioned plea for a sentence that would leave room for rehabilitation and eventual re-entry into society. Your Honor, we are asking the court to impose the minimum sentence of 30 years for the murder conviction, with concurrent rather than consecutive sentences for the related charges, Geller argued. We must remember that adolescent brain development continues well into the 20s, particularly in areas responsible for impulse control, risk assessment, and understanding long-term consequences. Geller presented the court with evaluations from 3 mental health professionals who had examined Viola since her conviction, all suggesting that, with appropriate treatment, she could eventually be rehabilitated. A 70-year sentence effectively throws away any possibility of redemption or contribution to society, Geller concluded. It says that we have given up on the possibility that a 17-year-old can change, grow, or atone for even the most terrible actions. Judge Eleanor Weaver's sentencing decision was preceded by a comprehensive explanation of her reasoning, addressing the complex factors at play in a case involving a juvenile defendant convicted of premeditated murder. In determining an appropriate sentence, I must balance several competing considerations, Judge Weaver began. I must consider the defendant's age and potential for rehabilitation, the safety of the community, the deterrent effect on others, and most importantly, the severity of the crime itself and the irreparable harm done to the victim and his family. The judge acknowledged the arguments for leniency based on Viola's age, but emphasized that her actions demonstrated a level of planning and intent rarely seen even in adult cases. The evidence presented at trial established beyond any doubt that this was not an impulsive act or a momentary lapse in judgment, but rather the culmination of months of escalating threats, surveillance, and preparation, all documented in the defendant's own words and actions. Judge Weaver continued by addressing Viola directly, her tone firm but not without compassion. Ms. Colleen, your case represents one of the most troubling examples of premeditated violence I have encountered in my 20 years on the bench. The calculated nature of your actions, from the explicit threats you sent to Mateo Martinez to your methodical preparation for his murder, demonstrates a clear understanding of what you were doing at every stage. The judge referenced specific evidence from the trial, including Viola's final threatening message sent hours before the murder and her words to Mateo in the moment before shooting him. Your documented threats weren't emotional hyperbole or teenage venting. They were declarations of intent that you then carried out exactly as described, taking a promising young life for no reason other than your inability to accept the end of a relationship." Judge Weaver paused briefly before delivering her sentence. "It is therefore the judgment of this court that you be committed to the Oregon Department of Corrections for a term of 70 years, with the possibility of parole after serving a minimum of 50 years. The courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions, audible gasps, muffled sobs from Viola's family, and a visible exhalation from the Martinez family as the sentence was announced. Viola Colleen collapsed into her seat, her body folding forward as the reality of spending the next 5 decades in prison washed over her. At 17, the sentence meant she would be 67 years old before even being eligible for parole consideration, effectively ensuring she would spend her entire young adulthood and middle age incarcerated. Judge Weaver allowed several minutes for the courtroom to settle before explaining the specific breakdown of the sentence: 30 years for the first-degree murder conviction, 20 years for breaking and entering with intent to commit a violent felony, 10 years for theft of a firearm, and 10 years for aggravated stalking, with each sentence to be served consecutively rather than concurrently. This sentence reflects not only the heinous nature of the crime itself, but also the extensive planning and the clear documentation of intent that preceded it, Judge Weaver concluded, bringing the proceedings to a close with a final strike of her gavel. The aftermath of Viola Colleen's sentencing reverberated throughout Portland and beyond, sparking intense debates about juvenile justice, digital threats, and missed opportunities for intervention. National news organizations descended on the city, framing the case as emblematic of broader issues including teenage mental health crises, the proper interpretation of threatening messages in the digital age, and whether the adult criminal justice system is appropriately equipped to handle juvenile offenders regardless of the severity of their crimes. Legal experts appeared on television panels analyzing Judge Weaver's decision, with opinions sharply divided between those who viewed the sentence as appropriately reflecting the calculated nature of the crime and those who argued that even the most serious juvenile offenses should include meaningful opportunities for rehabilitation and eventual re-entry into society during the defendant's lifetime. In response to the case, the Oregon legislature began considering a bill dubbed Mateo's Law, which would establish clearer protocols for evaluating and responding to threatening communications, particularly those made by and targeted at minors. The proposed legislation would require schools to implement comprehensive threat assessment procedures, mandate reporting of explicit threats to law enforcement, and create a statewide database for tracking concerning behaviors that might indicate progression toward violence. State Senator Maria Gonzalez, the bill's primary sponsor, explained that the legislation aimed to identify potential intervention points before threats escalated to violence. The tragedy of the Martinez-Colleen case is that there were numerous warning signs and explicit threats documented over a period of months, yet no effective intervention occurred until it was too late. Mateo's Law will establish clear responsibility and accountability for addressing threatening behaviors before they escalate to tragedy. 6 months after the sentencing, Miguel and Elena Martinez established the Mateo Martinez Foundation for Youth Conflict Resolution, dedicated to preventing relationship violence among teenagers through education, early intervention, and support services. The Foundation's first initiative was a peer mediation program implemented in Portland high schools, training students to recognize warning signs of unhealthy relationship dynamics and provide resources to classmates experiencing or exhibiting controlling behaviors. "We cannot bring back our son," Miguel Martinez explained. At the Foundation's launch event, attended by hundreds of community members at Roosevelt High School's gymnasium, but we can honor his memory by helping other young people find healthy ways to manage conflict and process rejection without resorting to threats or violence. The foundation also established a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in mental health services, particularly those focused on adolescent intervention and crisis prevention. Viola Colleen's case became a landmark in Oregon's legal history, frequently cited in subsequent trials involving juvenile defendants and in cases where digital threats preceded physical violence. The Portland Police Bureau developed new training protocols based on the case, instructing officers on how to properly evaluate and document threatening communications as potential evidence of premeditation, rather than dismissing them as merely emotional expressions. Detective Gabriel Fisher, whose methodical investigation had built the connection between Viola's threats and her actions, began conducting workshops for law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest, sharing investigative techniques for cases involving digital evidence of escalating threatening behavior. The Colleen case demonstrates that when someone tells you who they are and what they intend to do, we need to take those words seriously, Fisher explained during a training session recorded for police academies nationwide. Documented threats, particularly those that increase in specificity and are accompanied by stalking or surveillance behaviors, represent genuine declarations of intent that require immediate intervention. The educational impact of the case extended to Portland's schools, where administrators implemented new policies for monitoring and addressing threatening communications between students. Roosevelt High School, where both Viola and Mateo had been seniors, became a model for these reforms, establishing a threat assessment team that included counselors, teachers, and security personnel trained to evaluate concerning behaviors and implement appropriate interventions. The school also developed a curriculum addressing healthy relationship dynamics, emotional regulation, and appropriate responses to rejection, which was subsequently adopted by schools throughout Oregon. Principal Jennifer Harris described these changes as part of Mateo's legacy. We lost 2 students that day, one to death and one to incarceration. Our responsibility now is to ensure that we don't miss the warning signs that might prevent another tragedy. Viola Colleen's first year in the Coffee Creek Correctional Facility Women's Prison was documented through reports from her parents and attorney, who described her ongoing struggle to come to terms with both her actions and the consequences she now faced. The Colleen family established a trust fund to support Viola's continuing education while incarcerated, though they acknowledged the painfully limited scope of her future prospects. In a statement released on the 1-year anniversary of Mateo's murder, the Colleens expressed their continued grief for the Martinez family while also describing their own parallel journey of loss. We mourn daily for Mateo and the immeasurable pain our daughter's actions caused his family. We also mourn for the daughter we knew, the child with unlimited potential who made a series of incomprehensible choices that destroyed multiple lives, including her own. The statement concluded with a plea for parents to take threatening communication seriously and seek immediate professional intervention when teenagers exhibit controlling or obsessive behaviors in relationships, regardless of how uncomfortable those conversations might be. The lasting legacy of the case extended beyond Portland to influence national conversations about digital threats and their relationship to physical violence. Legal scholars published analyses examining how Viola's documented threats had established premeditation in ways that created new precedents for evaluating evidence in the digital age. Mental health professionals used the case study in developing improved protocols for assessing when teenage expressions of anger or rejection cross the line from emotional venting to genuine warning signs of potential violence. Social media platforms implemented enhanced monitoring systems for detecting threatening language, particularly in contexts involving terminated relationships or patterns of harassment. The case became required reading in criminal justice programs and law schools, examining not just the legal proceedings, but the multiple points at which intervention might have prevented tragedy if the documented threats had been taken more seriously by those in positions to intervene. As Portland moved forward, the physical reminders of both Mateo Martinez and Viola Colleen gradually transformed from raw wounds into permanent markers of a tragedy that had changed the community. At Roosevelt High School, a bench installed near the soccer field bore a plaque with Mateo's name and the words "Scholar, Athlete, Friend, a Life of Promise." The Martinez family restaurant reopened 6 months after the murder, becoming a gathering place for community healing and conversations about preventing relationship violence among teenagers. Viola Colleen's former home in the West Hills was sold, her parents eventually moving to another state to escape the constant reminders of their daughter's crimes. The courtroom where the trial had unfolded returned to handling other cases, though legal professionals who worked there often referenced the Colleen case when discussing the power of documented threats as evidence of premeditation. Together, these physical and institutional changes reflected the dual nature of the case's legacy, both a cautionary tale about the progression from threatening words to violent actions and a catalyst for reforms designed to prevent similar tragedies through earlier recognition and intervention when teenagers make explicit threats against those who reject them.